Hey Wargamers, with the release of the new Codex Tau Empire, there is a complete reimagining of how Tau function as a faction, and so we as players have to reassess how we build our armies. One tool we might use in starting that process is looking at the offensive point efficiency of any given unit, and that's what we did in the last videos. We looked at a bunch of different units, figured out which ones are most point efficient in dealing with a variety of different targets. And in that discussion, I mentioned several times that crisis suits are one of the most efficient choices. However, I did not specify the particular loadout, and that is because the loadout for crisis suits are highly diverse and extremely variable. So that is what we are going to do today, talk about which loadouts you might want to select for your crisis suits for any given target. Notably, this edition of the Codex probably is the most complex when it comes to crisis suit loadouts out of the history of the faction. In the past, there's been a variety of rules that they've used to regulate how crisis suits are armed. Originally, you could just take one of each weapon type, and so you didn't have a lot of choice. The missile pod plasma rifle loadout was generally how you went. Not always, but generally. But there wasn't a lot of variety, right? You didn't have a lot of choices there. Then came the period of time when they said, okay, now you can take multiples of each weapon at a constant cost. And that really opened up the playbook, but it also made it a very simple system to spam, right? You just identify which weapon you want to use and spam that. Have an extreme degree of specialization in your crisis suits, but maximize the output in that way. So let's say you would take, fusion blasters or cyclic ion blasters or missile pods, right? You could just spam whatever weapon you wanted, and that was a pretty straightforward system. Now, they have changed it significantly by changing the cost of each weapon depending on how many of that weapon you have. So often it's going up by increments of 5, but not always. And so that introduces a trade-off between specialization and the price of a suit. A highly specialized suit is going to cost a lot, right? If you're going all in on fusion blasters, that's going to cost a lot compared to taking one of multiple different weapon types. And so with this trade-off in place, suddenly the efficiency of any given weapon is going to be dependent on the other weapons that you select. If you take a bunch of fusion blasters, for example, and specialize in those fusion blasters are going to be less efficient than if you were to take just a single fusion blaster because of the increasing cost associated with taking multiples. That means that we can no longer just assess which weapon is most efficient, but instead have to consider the context, blowing up the math hammer here in a way that we have to consider all the iterations and then assess at that crisis suit level which loadouts are most efficient. We can no longer just select a weapon. We have to consider the entirety of the suit when determining optimal loadouts. Now, which combinations are most efficient? Well, it depends on the suit too. Crisis suits themselves can take 3 weapons, same as before, but now they have an extra slot for support systems. Many of those support systems aren't going to have a direct impact on output, so they aren't necessarily things that we need to consider here. So we can assume that we're just going to take 3 weapons and look at the math there. Bodyguards, on the other hand, have 3 hardpoints, including a support system. So if you're going to take a support system on bodyguards, you're going to lose a weapon slot. So often you see that crisis suits themselves are more efficient compared to bodyguards alone. This means that there are 84 different loadouts across 7 weapon systems for a crisis suit, right? There's 84 different combinations that we can select, ranging from 1 of each weapon to 3 of a particular weapon. And so 84 different loadouts that we have to assess, do the math on each of them, and compare. Now, before we get into the specifics of which loadouts we might want to use in which circumstances, a few details of how I'm going to go about this. For one thing, I'm not going to be considering support systems. That's for a few reasons. One is that support systems on mainline crisis suits don't compete for hardpoint anymore, assuming we're only taking 1 support system. So we don't have to account for that taking up an opportunity. We can just assume that we're always going to have 3 weapons. That makes things a lot more simple. Additionally, a lot of those support systems are more utility-based now, or at least more situational, right? Dealing with large unit sizes, dealing with things in cover, right? So it's not always a clear-cut benefit to your offensive output. There's no such thing as advanced targeting system on crisis suits anymore, for example, so we can't just factor in a -1 AP or anything like that. It's much more conditional. So we're just going to put that to the side. And we also don't have to deal with them in terms of the overall cost of the suit in general, because a lot of those support systems are free or included in the cost of the crisis suit. So we don't have to consider it in our denominator either, which is useful. Now, the other thing is dealing with fusion blasters and cyclic ion blasters, right? Both of those have rules that can increase their output depending on the scenario. Fusion blasters have a Melta rule, ion blasters can overcharge, and so you can get higher output based on those criteria. Now, in my main efficiency video, I just ignored these for the purposes of comparisons. But here, we're going to account for them in a kind of stepwise way. So we'll first look at just the standard profiles, and we'll go through all the rankings of loadouts, assuming that we're using standard profiles, which are going to be applicable more often. And then we're going to run the same calculations, saying that fusion is always in Melta and cyclic ion blasters are always being overcharged, and see how that changes things. And so for the next few slides here, I'm going to show you the 2 most efficient loadouts for a bunch of different targets that I have grouped into different kind of target categories. And then I will show you all loadouts in the top 10 for all of those categories. So if there's loadouts that show up consistently across those targets. So let's say you're looking at targeting infantry, for example. What are the things that are consistent performers across all those targets, not just one of those profiles that I've selected? So for our first group of targets, we're going to look at general infantry. So this is going to be Guard or Xenos infantry, basically. And for toughness 3 with a 5-up save and 1 wound, we see that 2 flamers and a burst cannon, as well as 3 flamers, are the 2 most point efficient builds, assuming that you can use whatever weapons you want. Now, something to note here, right, is that flamers are super points efficient against a lot of different targets because they have a high volume of fire, right? We'll see flamers pop up consistently throughout this video because flamers have like a floor of 3 hits to begin with, right? They just put out a lot of shots, even though those shots are low quality. Same thing too for burst cannons. Burst cannon produces a higher quality shot, but it produces a lot of shots consistently. So, right, we see flamers and burst cannons being really good choices for infantry, and that makes sense, right? Like they're just there to mow down lots of different, gribbly guys. For toughness 4, 3-up save, 1 wound, we see the same thing. 2 flamers burst, 3 flamers as being the top 2 picks. For toughness 5 and a 6-up save with 1 wound, so like an orc, we see that, flamers and burst in either arrangement. So 2 flamers and a burst, or 2 bursts and a flamer are the top 2. If we're looking more generally across the board here, which builds show up consistently in the top 10, we see again, 2 flamers and a burst cannon. That shouldn't be a surprise. It was the top pick in all 3 of these. 3 flamers, 2 flamers and an AFP, 2 flamers and a cyclic ion, flamer burst, AFP, 2 bursts and a flamer burst, cyclic ion, right? And again, that's assuming that cyclic ion is not being overcharged here. We see a lot of profiles here that just make sense, right? We have a high volume of fire, not necessarily of the highest quality of shots, and so we're getting cheap shots that we can get lots of. And that makes sense that works well against infantry. Moving on to some marine profiles, starting with your basic Primaris at toughness 4, 3-up save, 2 wounds. We see the flamer, plasma, and burst combo being the most efficient here, followed by 2 flamers and a plasma. Again, that volume of fire afforded by the flamer is really valuable. And then we've complemented it with a high quality shot of the plasma rifle. For toughness 5, 3-up save, 3 wounds, we see 2 plasma and missile, and 2 plasma and a flamer being your top 2 picks there. And then for toughness 5, 2-up save, 5 wounds, we're looking at 2 plasma and a fusion, or 2 fusion and a plasma. So once we get to 5 wounds with that 2-up save, we're really looking at those high quality shots being the drivers here. That's a big shift from what we saw with the basic Primaris profile, where we saw flamers being incorporated. For the 2-up 5 wound profile, we really want those multi-damage, high AP shots. And so plasma and fusion then become the better picks. And so the category that I have here as Marines is quite diverse in that way. So we see only a couple builds actually show up consistently across these profiles. We see 2 plasma and a flamer being fairly well matched across the board, and we also see that plasma flamer fusion is well matched across the board. So if you're looking to deal with all of these things with a single unit, you might want to consider one of those 2 builds as opposed to any of the specific builds shown on the left. Moving on to some smaller vehicles or monsters, with the toughness 5, 4-up save, 6 wound profile, we see plasma fusion flamer, plasma missile flamer as being good choices. Again, the flamer shows up here because it's a number of shots, a good number of shots at a cheap cost. That's why it's point efficient. That's why it's driving this efficiency. For toughness 6, 4-up save, 12 wounds, we see Plasma Fusion Flamer, Plasma Missile Flamer, so same thing. And then for toughness 7 with the 3-up save and 8 wounds, this is true for 12 wounds too, right? So if the number of wounds here actually doesn't really make that much of a difference. We see 2 Plasma Infusion as well as Plasma Fusion Flamer being your top picks. If we're looking to deal with vehicles or monsters more generally, as opposed to any particular profile, we see that the Plasma Flamer Fusion, Plasma Fusion Missile, 2 Plasma and a Fusion, and 2 Plasma and a Flamer builds are your more consistent generalized builds. Now looking at larger vehicles, things that are toughness 8, we see that for toughness 8, 3-up save, 12 wounds, we need 2 Plasma and a Fusion Blaster, or 2 Fusion Blasters and a Plasma Rifle. For a toughness 8 with a 2-up save and 16 wounds, we need 2 Plasma and a Fusion, or 2 Fusion and a Plasma, so same thing. Toughness 8, 3-up save, 24 wounds with a 5++, so 5-up invulnerable save. Things change a little bit here where 2 Plasma and a Fusion are more efficient, and then a Fusion Blaster, Plasma Rifle, and Burst Cannon showing up here. Again, it's because it's cheap and it has a large number of shots. So that's for your knight profile, right? And then if we're looking to deal with larger vehicles or monsters across the board, we're looking at 2 Plasma and a Fusion, or 2 Fusion and a Plasma, or a combination of Fusion, Plasma, and then either a Burst Cannon, a Flamer, or a Missile Pod. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at things with invulnerable saves more generally. So we're going to look at things that are smaller things with invulnerable saves, and then next we'll look at larger things with invulnerable saves. And I want to say I've adjusted my profiles here a little bit to be more accurate to contemporary data sheets. So if you were comparing this to your last efficiency video, there are some different profiles presented here. So for toughness 3, 6-up save, 1 wound with a 4++, we see 2 flamers and a burst cannon, as well as 3 flamers. Same thing for toughness 4 with a 3-up save and 2 wounds with a 4++. And then for toughness 5, a 2-up save, 3 wounds, and a 4++. We see 2 missile pods and a plasma, as well as a missile pod, plasma rifle, and cyclic ion blaster as being your top picks. Again, that's a pretty wide range of profiles. And so if we're looking at the top build across this field more generally, we see 2 flamers and then basically anything is showing up. 3 flamers, 2 burst cannon, and a flamer, burst cannon, AFP, flamer, burst cannon, cyclic ion. Those all do well for the toughness 3 and toughness 4 profiles. They don't actually show up well for the toughness 5 profile. And so I'm going to give you 2 additional toughness 5 profiles to consider. That would be the 2 plasma rifles and a missile pod, or a missile pod, a plasma rifle, and a flamer also does well for the toughness 5. So again, this is a really diverse field here. And so you're probably not going to build a crisis suit to take on all of these. You're going to have to specialize a little bit, either looking more for those toughness 3, toughness 4 invulnerable save targets, or that toughness 5 invulnerable save target. Now shifting to look at larger things with invulnerable saves. For toughness 6, a 3-up save, 8 wounds, and a 5++, we see some consistencies between this and the toughness 5 profile from before, where missile pod, plasma flamer, missile pod, plasma fusion, missile pod, fusion flamer, or fusion plasma flamer are your top 4 builds. Again, this is going to be a place where you see a lot of divergence, right? So between the toughness 6 profile and now the toughness 7 profile with a 3-up save, 12 wounds, and a 4++, now we've shifted away from that missile pod plasma build and see more flamers showing up. So 2 flamers and a plasma, flamer plasma fusion, 2 flamers and a fusion, missile pod plasma, and a flamer shows up here again at the end. So very different profiles. Some degree of specialization is going to be required if you want to be the most efficient against those targets. Okay, so that was all using standard profiles, right? And for a lot of those things, you might want to be able to use Melta. You might want to overcharge your cyclic ion blasters, and that's going to have a really big impact on the points efficiency, right? We're massively increasing the damage on either of those weapon types, and so you would expect that their efficiency would go way up once you can account for overcharging in Melta. The thing is, of course, that overcharging is risky, but not too risky for crisis suits, right? Crisis suits are core, and so they're going to benefit from a commander's Master of War aura, being able to reroll ones. And crisis suits are generally going to want to be around commanders anyway because of the way commanders now function, largely as a buffing source for crisis suits. So this makes sense that we can basically assume that you're going to want to be overcharging your cyclic ion blasters pretty regularly. And so assuming that you have a commander, if you don't have a commander, you probably will want to be a little bit more conservative with that. And so we can look at the math assuming this. And then also fusion blasters require you to be close, which historically has been a pretty sketchy proposition, but it's not as dangerous anymore, right? For one thing, crisis suits are tougher. They're more durable now. They have more wounds. They also have a better melee profile in general. Battlesuits in general have a better melee profile. And so we can see that being less concerning. And then also with Ka, at least, we want to be close, right? So being close isn't necessarily the bad thing or the scary thing that it used to be. Now it's just part of the strategy. So we don't necessarily have to view that as a negative or as risky of a thing as it used to be. So we're going to look at how overcharging in Melta affects these profiles. And basically when we do that, we see that crisis suits are in the top 3 for any multi-wound target, right? Any multi-wound target is going to be very well dealt with by crisis suits, either as the most efficient choice or second most efficient choice, or in a few cases, third most efficient choice. But you see crisis suits perform very well against any multi-wound target, whether that's a Primaris Marine or a Knight. And the things that are doing better than crisis suits in these efficiency rankings are sometimes things like the Pathfinders with a rail rifle or Vespid that don't have the same value as crisis suits overall strategically. And so this makes crisis suits just really, really powerful units if we're combining these high efficiency offensive properties with all the other benefits that crisis suits bring compared to the alternatives. You see crisis suits do very well across the board with generally pretty consistent loadout, right? They can either take 2 fusion blasters and a plasma rifle. Again, that's assuming that the fusion blasters are within Melta range, within half range. 2 plasma rifles and a fusion blaster also does very well. And then a fusion plasma cyclic ion blaster loadout does very well too across the board of multi-wound targets, especially against things that have an invulnerable save. So we see that fusion plasma cyclic ion loadout do very well against anything with an invulnerable save. Otherwise, a combination of fusion and plasma does equally or better. So, generally some form of consensus here across these different unit profiles that really makes it redundant in the way that I'm not just going to go back through all those same profiles again. I'm just going to tell you that these are the loadouts that you want to use if you are overcharging or within Melta range. Okay, so we went through this in a pretty granular fashion. If we take a step back, what does it all mean, right? What's the kind of the big picture here? And if we look at those rankings, we see that in general, there's a trend of burst cannons and flamers being effective for low toughness targets, plasma and fusion being effective for high toughness targets, and that's pretty obvious, right? You didn't need me to tell you that. But the important part is that there's no vastly dominant build outside the context of assuming Melta and assuming overcharging for cyclic ion blasters and fusion blasters. So if we're talking about more generally, there wasn't something that just showed up all the time as being the best thing ever. It was a little bit more variable than that. And we saw relatively minor differences in efficiency across the builds that we selected, right? So we're generally talking about less than a 10% difference in the efficiency. And yes, 10% difference can be meaningful, but it's not necessarily massive in the context of choosing crisis suits over something else. So what that means is that your playstyle is probably a little bit more influential than the actual math hammer on this, right? You should mix and match weapons within a niche that fit your playstyle, right? So if you're looking for something to deal with high toughness stuff, yeah, mix and match plasma fusion in a way that makes sense to you, right? So if you want to throw a missile pod in there, go for it. If you want to throw a cyclic ion blaster in there, go for it, right? Like the actual specifics of what is the most point efficient are pretty minor compared to the implications of those different weapons for how you're actually going to move them and deploy them on the battlefield. So you have some flexibility here, which is encouraging, right? It shows that this change in the way that we point crisis suits is effective in promoting a diverse range of weapon loadouts, right? There's not just one thing that shows up as being the best. You have options no matter what you're trying to use crisis suits for. And so for me, I'm probably going to choose something kind of like this. So if I'm looking to build my crisis suits to deal with hordes or large units, we're talking about maybe bringing 2 burst cannons and a flamer. I like this more than the 2 flamer burst cannon option, which performs comparably in a lot of cases because burst cannons have to roll to hit, and so there's some things that trigger off of that. That means that they're more buffable. They also have longer range, so there's some benefits to taking the burst cannon over the flamer in that regard. For dealing with elite things with invulnerable saves, probably I'm going to be taking plasma, fusion, and cyclic ion blaster, again because that combo showed up pretty consistently across the board for those higher toughness things, especially if you are overcharging and in Melta range and it has an invulnerable save, then this is a top performer, certainly. And then if I'm dealing with vehicles, I'm going to bring 2 fusion and a plasma rifle. Could also go with 2 plasma and a fusion, of course, but the punchiness of the fusion blaster is nice, and I like having just the option to have that little boost in efficiency brought by Melta range. Now, before we wrap up here, I do want to mention commanders, because commanders can take up to 4 weapons, which means that there's even more options, more versatility that you could have with a commander compared to a crisis suit alone. But when we run the calculations on that, it doesn't come out favorably for them. In fact, they're actually very points inefficient compared to a lot of different choices, not just crisis suits. The exception to this is that Cold Stars with a high output burst cannon can be pretty points efficient for some targets, but in general, commanders are not a point efficient platform, right? This is pretty different from how they were in some points in the past, right? Sometimes we saw commanders be really points efficient because they had that 2-up ballistic skill and you could load them up with weapons and they could be really punchy. Now they are not costed to do that anymore. Now they are costed based on the buffs that they provide, not their offensive output. So really we're looking at commanders as being commanders, not armies of one, right? They're not there to be the huge gun that you use to take out a particular target. They're there to be part of the army as a whole, which I like. I think that's a good change. But that means that you want to build your commanders mostly based on your strategy, more so than the actual damage output that any one commander is going to give in most cases. So they're, for instance, a really reliable platform for prototypes, right? If you can only take one prototype weapon, you really want it to hit, right? So if you're bringing something that you need to have hit, that you can't just take more of, then yeah, put it on a commander, right? Because then you're going to have some assurance that it's actually going to land where you want it to land. Similarly, it seems like putting a shield on a commander is probably a good idea, right? It's not going to increase their offensive efficiency, but it's going to keep them alive longer, and you want them to be alive because now they are a critical component of your strategy aside from just being the big gun, right? Now they're buffing units. Now they're doing a lot of things that you need them to be on the tabletop for, and so you're going to opt for something that allows you to remain on the battlefield more so than something that's going to just make him a little bit more punchy, right? So giving up a weapon in favor for that shield generator is going to make sense, and it's going to lower their point efficiency even more. And so maxing out on weapons on a commander seems like a trap, right? They're not going to be point efficient if you do that anyway, and so you're putting good points after bad in some ways, and instead you really want to focus on your commander being more of a component of the greater whole, the greater good, if you will, than just an army of one, right? So we don't necessarily have to max out on weapons. We don't necessarily have to look for the most efficient build. We want to think about something that fits into our strategy more generally, and select weapons that fit into that strategy, as opposed to something that is picked just because it has a really high damage output on its own. All right, so that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What builds are you going to be using? Would you like me to run this again with different things in mind? Let me know and we can have a discussion. As always, thanks for watching, and of course, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. A while ago I made my own miniature. If you are interested in showing your support for the channel on the tabletop, you can pick one up either on Etsy if you're in the US or directly through me worldwide. Special thanks to our sponsor, the Magnet Baron, and also all the good folks over on Patreon, especially Mate Monk, Marcy, A Little Pink Monster, Bennaby Jones, Durza, Ever Keller, Robbie Goodwin, Jose Gomez, Ruger, Drew Pratley, Michael Byrne, Zealous Brimstone, Scott Heater, Stephen Cowan, Jared Egler, Chris Kessler, Tao Oswell, and Shifty.